I hope you guys have had a Merry Christmas. You may wonder about the timing of this video. It certainly doesn't feel particularly festive as a topic, but it is a dark, gloomy, rainy day today, perfect for a dark, gloomy topic. So, welcome to a very special multi-part Trex Arms series on the history of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Explosives, etc. Now, the timing of these videos I think actually makes sense. It's not just that alcohol, tobacco, and firearms make for a great Christmas gift list. I have been researching and writing these scripts for this series for a long time. And I think now is the time. As a new administration starts in January, there will be new leadership in the White House. There will be new leadership at the ATF. And there's already talk about dissolving the agency completely. So I thought now could be the best possible time to get some of this research, out in the public for discussion. A better understanding of how we got here, where we are today, could be useful for framing the conversation. So I would like to start that at the beginning. Now, technically, the ATF has not been called the ATF since the 1970s, but the general responsibilities of alcohol, tobacco, firearms goes back to the 1920s, when the United States banned the possession and consumption of alcohol. Now, the way that our government handled Prohibition is very important for this. Technically, it did actually start before 1919 by quite a bit. The first alcohol taxes in this country went into effect in 1789, but we're talking about something more than just tax collection. We're talking about enforcement. That also starts before Prohibition. 13 of the 30 United States had actually prohibited the consumption of alcohol prior to the Civil War. But then the federal government, the Republican Party in particular, backtracked on that because they really needed all of the German, Irish, and Italian immigrants that they were importing to fight on the side of the Union to, fight on the side of the Union. So they became very pro-drink until after they had defeated the Confederacy. And then, after the Civil War, it was the children of the abolitionists who were looking for a big social cause to be sanctimonious busybodies about. And so they brought back this idea that alcohol was responsible for most of society's ills. Now, to be fair, alcohol abuse was a definite problem then, as it is now, and there were a bunch of people who were trying to solve this problem in different ways. Now, my favorite way to tackle this issue was demonstrated by a businessman named Arthur Guinness. He decided to help the working man by inventing a new drink that was delicious, nutritious, and far too stout to get totally wasted on. And if you are a private citizen, this is one of the greatest ways to tackle a social issue. You do the work, you put your own skin in the game, you develop a solution that people will buy so that it is a long-term self-supporting effort, and then you believe in your project enough to take out a 900-year lease on your warehouses. The story of Guinness is actually pretty awesome. But the prohibitionists took a very different approach. They wanted to complain and let the state do all of the work. Now, there are already a bunch of laws on the books for dealing with the actual crimes of drunk and disorderly conduct, and there were penalties for the other crimes that people were committing while drunk. Like, all of this already existed on the books, but they wanted something far more sweeping and expansive. They wanted the entire state to use the power and force of law to eradicate not just alcohol abuse, but alcohol itself. And so they demanded that the government be expanded in its authority and its power to address an issue that was way outside of its jurisdiction. And to do this expansion in a way that was morally indefensible and physically impossible. The emotional rhetoric around the issue pitched it as a national social justice emergency. Not sure if that sounds familiar to you, but it was pretty emotional. Women smashed up saloons, suffragettes demanded the right to vote because men would never, ever have the courage to ban the devil's brew on their own, and eventually, you know what happened. Congress caved to the pressure. The other thing that is an important piece of this is up until 1913, 90% of all federal revenue came from alcohol tax, which meant that there was, a lot of hesitancy to outlaw something that was generating so much revenue. But something very cool happened in 1913. That was the introduction of the income tax. So now it's fine to abolish alcohol. You can just raise the other taxes. No more taxing the consumption of a specific drink. You can tax all of the productive work of everybody. Ultimately, the few serious, good faith prohibitionists who genuinely had people's best interest at heart and were just kind of wrong about how to do it, they got played. They became the instruments of suffragettes and big government taxation. And then the bad faith prohibitionists who just wanted power, well, they got exactly what they wanted. They got a new sweeping law that came down very hard on law-abiding citizens who had never been part of the problem. It had a much more severe effect on them than the few folks who were already breaking the existing laws.
Got the jitters, got the jitters.
In 1919, the Volstead Act went into effect, and the Treasury Department created a federal task force to enforce it. And what followed was, and I do not put this lightly because the bar is extremely high, one of the most spectacular failures of government action that the world has ever seen. The first obvious problem was that the government did not remotely have the means to enforce this insane law. I mean, clearly, if law enforcement cannot handle the drunks, it is not going to be able to handle all of the people who just want a drink. So obviously, this was the justification for adding hundreds of new IRS goons, but it just wasn't enough. They probably should have tried 87,000. I think that's supposedly the magic number.
What do you do at the Bureau, Mr. Wallace?
Oh, I'm an accountant.
An accountant?
Yes, sir, and the Bureau has sent me here.
Would you excuse me? Please.
Within a few months after the passage of the Volstead Act, organized crime had way more men and way more money and way more material than law enforcement ever would. Period. By the end of the Prohibition experiment, the sheer amount of alcohol available in the United States had at least quadrupled. There were 3 times as many speakeasies as there had ever been registered bars.
First, the public itself rebels against the government's attempt to legislate morality. Chicago alone boasts of having 20,000 speakeasies. Millions of Americans find that breaking the law can be fun.
The consumption of hard liquor was far greater and far more widespread. Now, I realize I'm making a pretty big claim. And while we're talking about historical topics like this, there's a couple of ways that we could do it. I suppose we could put super detailed footnotes all over the screen, covering everything that I'm talking about, and all the books that the data came out of. But we're not really that kind of YouTube channel. We're more likely to just throw up a clip of Kevin Costner busting gangsters. However, I do think that we should link to some of the different resources because a lot of this prohibitionary research came out of this book, Last Call by Daniel Okrent. It is an excellent historical documentation. And then Paul Johnson has a couple of books. History of the American People is an important one for talking more about the stuff that was going on around Prohibition, the why and the who. And then he also wrote Modern Times, which is a fantastic look at just the changes that were happening not just in America, but around the world at the time. And we will get into a little bit more of those in episode 2 of this video. These books make a great case that Prohibition resulted in more alcohol sales, more alcohol consumption, and even pushed the way that alcohol was made into a darker and sleazier direction. But that is only the most obvious failure. There's so many other ways that the Prohibition experiment did incredible damage and the exact opposite of what the prohibitionists had claimed. So first of all, there was a complaint that all of these German, Irish, and Italian immigrants who had come over to fight the Confederates were lazy, drunken louts, and Prohibition did not, as promised, properly integrate them into the American melting pot. Instead, it actually divided them into separate communities, further coalescing them around their culturally appropriate organized crime traditions. We had Irish and Italian and even Jewish crime families emerging in the various cities and further locking in some of those cultural and ethnic tensions. Secondly, the honest, small, family-owned breweries and distilleries were basically destroyed, as well as the pubs, the taverns, the restaurant. You know, the actual existing community centers, they were completely wiped out either by federal agents or gangster monopolies fighting over their turf. So all this platitude about rescuing people from drink, creating a better opportunity for human flourishing, it only served to create rival gangs in a battle for power. And these kind of power struggles are always destructive to the people in the middle. We're the ones getting trodden underfoot. Third, allowing police officers to confiscate alcohol from even America's poorest families was supposed to make them heroic saviors, but instead it pushed them to be more tyrannical, more incompetent, more easily corruptible, usually a combination of all three. The principal lawmen who opposed these bad laws were driven out because, well, obviously, how can a guy who opposes a new law be a lawman? The man is clearly a traitor or a mutineer. This is a very interesting point I want to get to in other videos. The idea that the lesser magistrate protects good people against bad laws took a real beating at this time in history, and is something that we need to get back. So, as those principal lawmen were moved out, pragmatic opportunists who wanted more power or money moved in. The fourth major failure, taking a stand against demon rum, was somehow supposed to transform Americans' politicians into these heroic paragons of moral virtue, taking the hard stands for the good of the people, whether the people like it or not. But they ended up enjoying flaunting their special privileges too much. Their hypocrisy and their corruption was on full display, and instead of taking principled stands, they actually learned to enjoy the power of a law that criminalized nearly all Americans. And then fifthly and finally, being rescued from drink by the compulsion of the messianic federal government was supposed to make the American populace more docile, more grateful, more indebted to, and more obedient to the state. But instead, it made the people resentful, angry, and disillusioned with everything associated with the whole mess. By 1933, everybody was so fed up with the entire thing that Congress not only revoked the Volstead Act, but they proposed the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, handing alcohol regulation back down to the states, who immediately legalized it, even Utah. Unfortunately, the 14 years of constant seizures of private goods, the total shutdown of a bunch of private businesses, the destructive chases and lethal battles between bootleggers and revenue officers, and the higher consumption of lower quality hooch, and the blatant corruption and authoritarianism, and I could go on and on. All this stuff left permanent damage to the heart of the nation. However, I do want to draw your attention to one specific, possibly isolated, but probably not incident in the midst of those 5 pretty significant failures, because I think this one shows the real issue at the heart of Prohibition. In the late 1920s, the federal government poisoned hundreds of thousands of barrels of industrial alcohol to prevent humans from drinking them. Now, there are lots of different ways and recipes to denature alcohol. You can range from making it too unpleasant to drink, or just pure deadly. And the government chose this latter one. And eventually, of course, that alcohol made it into the stream of traffic, and it ended up killing somewhere between 40 confirmed cases and many thousands of likely cases. Now, to be fair, people still die today from drinking various industrial solvents and denatured alcohol made with better recipes. So there is always the chance, right, that this is just a bad methyl alcohol combination and unscrupulous bootleggers were the ones actually stealing and distributing this stuff. So maybe the government's hands are clean, possibly. Except that public officials at the time, public health officials in New York, were horrified, and they called this an extermination. And the Anti-Saloon League also called it an extermination, but they were gleeful about it and were happy that the poisoned were committing suicide by drinking the poison. And then government officials were kind of a mixed bag. At best, unremorseful, and at worst, extremely smug. So I would say that this is a perfect example of how quickly people can lose the plot. Remember that just a few years earlier, Prohibition was being touted as something designed to protect people from the slow poison of alcohol. The greater well-being of individual drinkers and the nation was the entire justification for criminalizing booze. And obviously, turning this slow poison into a fast one is directly counterproductive to the entire stated goal of Prohibition itself. But after just a couple of years of enforcement, a lot of people have completely forgotten the justification and are only looking for compliance. The spirit of the law is being ignored, and forcing people to obey the letter of the law is the goal, even if it has lethal consequences. And this is why laws are really difficult to write, why we shouldn't write too many of them, and we certainly shouldn't write them too quickly. Bad laws often have a spirit and a letter that are at odds with each other, creating confusion and generally collateral damage. A bad law is usually one that is designed for the good of the collective people, but it will involve doing things that are bad for individual people. And this is why enforcement agencies are very hard to manage. They focus on the procedure and the regulations, which is good. That focus, however, can become all-consuming really quickly, and that erases a focus on the individual and human people that law enforcement is supposed to protect and serve, even to the point of, turning the very slow death of crippling alcoholism into a very fast death by federal poisoning, and still seeing that as a win. Now, obviously, this is only one relatively small incident in the much larger, huge, catastrophic, destructive mess that is Prohibition, but I want you to remember this point, the deliberate poisoning of alcohol, because we are going to come back to this in future episodes when we talk about what the ATF turns into, obviously. But let's get back to the mess. The 14 years were so messy, and they muddied the waters so much that it was basically impossible to just turn it off and go back to the ways that things were before. And apparently it was impossible to learn the proper lessons from this horrific mistake. Obviously, once all the states ratified the 21st Amendment, alcohol was once again legal to manufacture, to possess, and to consume. However, the small family-owned distilleries and breweries and pubs were gone. The blindness and injuries from the poisoned liquor remained. The organized crime operations remained. The corrupt and tyrannical law enforcement remained. The hypocritical politicians remained. The resentment of the American people remained. But more destructively, the idea that social problems should be solved by an expansion of government power also remained. That is why the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department, I mentioned both because these different task forces would report to different departments at different times. But the Bureau of Prohibition did not get abolished. It just got renamed to the Alcohol Tax Unit, and it went around collecting taxes on the now legal drinks. But if you want proof that big government hadn't learned any real lessons from this debacle, you only have to wait until 1934. That was the arrival of the National Firearms Act. 5 years ago, we talked a lot about the NFA and the process behind its passage in the Everything You Aren't Supposed to Know About Suppressors video, which I'm happy to say a lot of you have seen. But check it out if you haven't, and I will try not to rehash too much of the stuff that we've already covered in that video. But the basics are, the NFA was not brought by the people or by representatives of the people. No congressman wrote this bill. It was brought to Congress, fully formed and hastily written by FDR's guys. Specifically, I think his Attorney General, Homer Cummings. And Homer Cummings and the president demanded the immediate passage of this law due to a state of emergency. The emergency was not, as you might expect, a whole bunch of Prohibition agents sitting around twiddling their thumbs, but it was that there were a bunch of high-profile bank robbers killing people, and there were still some shocking machine gun murders, like the St. Valentine's Day massacre that had happened, and the government needed to act. Now, if we're being honest, we should point out that the gangsters created by Prohibition were very brutal, in a way that most Americans really hadn't seen since the Indian Wars, and local law enforcement was pretty poorly equipped to tackle Bonnie and Clyde in the new high-speed telephone-equipped bank robber gangs. But that had a lot less to do with firepower, and it actually had more to do with other factors. The people that they needed were the old-fashioned lawmen, most of whom who had been kicked out during Prohibition because they didn't like bad laws and they didn't like bad politicians telling them what to do. Despite Prohibition failing completely and comprehensively by every practical measure, and also failing legislatively and also failing constitutionally, the NFA goes all in on trying the exact same strategy. You deal with the crimes of the few by removing the rights of the many. And these are very clear rights this time, because if you remember, the Second Amendment is very adamant that these rights shall not be infringed. It's far easier to make a case that firearms are protected rights than booze. But the National Firearms Act was pretty all-encompassing. It proposed a ban on all suppressors, all machine guns, all short-barrel shotguns, all short-barrel rifles, and all handguns. Mere possession of these items would be a serious felony with serious jail time. And it's actually worse than it sounds, because the definition of machine gun in the original wording is so loose that it included every semi-automatic firearm. It's almost hard to comprehend just how draconian this bill was as it was written, and how many firearms it would have criminalized even in 1934.
That'll do it.
Which'll do it?
All of them.
All of them?
Yes, sir.
The text just covers this gigantic swath of private firearms, even though its proponents are talking almost exclusively about the Tommy gun, and a very few set of crimes committed by about 3 Tommy guns. Now, despite this happening almost 100 years ago, reading through the deliberations and conversations of the legislators in the congressional hearings is, well, it's almost exactly like hearing congressmen debating legislation today, because they really don't know anything about guns, and they really don't know anything about the technical considerations involved. And fortunately, this is one of the things that has changed, fortunately, the NRA was also there. At the very first hearing, Carl Frederick, president of the NRA at the time, he did a great job at pushing back against that sloppy language around machine guns and educating the legislators on what automatic and semi-automatic meant. But unfortunately, he did kind of make the assumption that the bill was inevitable, and he was obviously trying to do as much damage control as possible rather than stop it. Maybe he realized at that time that FDR's heavy-handed authoritarian techniques were kind of unstoppable. Or maybe the expectation of expert testimony in that kind of hearing back then was a little different. But I find myself wishing his opposition had been a little stronger, but I will say he does a fantastic job of answering questions. I'll link to transcripts of those conversations and deliberations down below so you can continue your research if you would like. It's quite a bit of conversation, but the long and short of it is they talk for a long time before the issue of Second Amendment rights and constitutionality even comes up. And then the government has come up with a cool dodge, this very neat little sidestep, because this gun bill, you see, is not really a gun bill, it's a gun tax. You can keep all your guns if you would like, you only have to buy a tax stamp for each one of them. And then some members in the committee asked if the U.S. government had the authority to tax a right. Well, maybe not, but this tax bill is actually a crime bill. That is Congress's business. Throughout the debate, the members of the federal government that are explaining the bill kind of waffle back and forth. The NFA can be a crime bill when it needs to be, and it can be a revenue bill when it needs to be. Unfortunately, it passed. Frederick of the NRA managed to get semi-automatic guns off the ban list, and even most congressmen wanted the mention of pistols deleted as well. The idea that the government would take away the very most useful, very most practical, very most affordable, and very most usable form of self-defense hardware at a time when crime was going through the roof would have cost them considerable votes. And since concealable pistols are no longer being taken off the streets, there's really no reason for short-barreled rifles or shotguns to stay on the verboten list, but they do, because who cares? There's not enough of them out there for it to affect the vote, so it's fine. They can just be banned, because this is not really a tax bill. It really is, functionally speaking, a ban. The tax stamp for each NFA item was set at $200, kind of arbitrarily. There's no reason for this other than that was the cost of one of those terrifying Thompson submachine guns.
Yeah, I'd like to have a look at that Thompson submachine gun. Would you be wanting the stick or the drum for the Tommy?
How many in a stick?
20 rounds.
I'll take a dozen. And 2 of them drums.
At the time, the Thompson was probably the very most expensive production firearm in the world. For context, most shotguns and pistols at the time were $5 to $10, and you could just mail order these. Anyone could do it from the Sears Roebuck catalog. $200 in 1934 money is a lot. It is equal to about $4,800 of today's money, which means that during the American Depression, the only people who could actually afford that $200 tax stamp were probably the Prohibition-era gangsters and bank robbers who were causing all the trouble. I want you guys to remember that the people actually using Tommy guns to commit crime are a very small group of guys, and we know exactly who they were. They were either some of the wealthiest people in the entire world, or guys like John Dillinger, who stole his Tommy gun from law enforcement officers, which means that the NFA is guaranteed to have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the kind of crime that justified the passage of the NFA. Even the argument that we needed more administrative weapons charges to go after people who were already committing horrific, brutal public murders is just ludicrous on its face. Do you remember a little earlier when I mentioned that bad laws often have a spirit and a letter that are at odds with one another? The NFA is a perfect example of that. It's violent crime is so high that we need to disarm all these potential victims over here. Powerless law enforcement is spread so thin that we need to make a wider collection of laws for them to enforce, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, it did become law. And now, the stage is set. Now you can see the foundation. Hopefully we've pointed out all the roots of this tree that is going to grow up and become the ATF. These are the expectations that the ATF is going to grow out of, which means that you are now ready for episode 2 of the true history of the ATF. That is where we're going to start looking at some specific actions and what the fruit of this tree is going to be and why people start calling it a rogue agency.